I'm a self-taught software engineer who's won a national coding championship, and in this video, I will be building a full stack web application using Postgres for the database, React for the front end, and NodeJS for the back end. This tutorial is scripted with visuals and documentation that took me years to learn and understand. I attached a Google Doc that will go through the entire tutorial step by step in the top of this description so you can follow along. I highly recommend. Let's get into it.
This is the 7-part framework I use when building applications. You can copy this, take a screenshot. This is the same roadmap we're going to use in this video. It has 3 main parts: front end, interface, and back end. I start with the front end because in my real world experience, the front end side of the application is finished first, then the back end side. Number 1 is views. Views are all the pages of the application. For example, in our application, we're going to have a home view, a sign up view, and an activities view. Second step is components. These are all the different parts inside of our pages. Here we have our home components, activity components, and sign up. Step 3 is state. This is going to be all the data we are displaying and modifying on the front end into our components. 4 is endpoints. This is how our front end and back end communicate to each other. 5 is database, where our data is stored and saved. Step 6 is building out the controllers, which is the backend functions that will handle the incoming request from the front end. And services is step 7, which will handle our logic that the controllers request. Here is a demonstration of the project. We start on the home page, then the user clicks get started and it gets redirected to a GitHub sign up page. Once logged in with GitHub, they get sent to their activities page where they can log an activity and see their totals, as well as a heat map. For this video, we're not going to focus on the leaderboard. And now we're moving on to the front-end setup. We're going to set up React with Vite and TypeScript, and we're going to run on a local host. So here we're going to run the command npm create Vite at latest. It's going to prompt you with a project name. You can just put habit tracker for devs or any other name that you would like for the project. Next up, it's going to tell you to select a framework. You should use React here instead of vanilla. That would be better. And then for selecting a variant, we're going to choose TypeScript. And now we're going to cd into that new folder that it just made and run npm i or npm install. And after all the dependencies were installed, you can run npm run dev, and that will run on a local 5173 host, which will display the basic layout for Vite. Now we're moving on to step 1, which is views. We're going to start building these pages out. For the view setup, we're going to create a routes folder and file, and we're going to create a new file per view inside of a views folder. And then we're going to export those functions and then make each one a route. So in this first video, we're going to use the command code space period to open up a VS Code terminal in our current location inside of the folder habit for devs, the one that we just made. Inside of that, we're going to make a new folder in source called views and another new folder for our routes called routes. Inside of the views folder, we're going to have mini folders per view. So we're going to have a folder for the home page, a folder for activities page, and a folder for sign up page. Each one of these folders will have a index.tsx file with a function that's export default function and the file name. So in this case, it'll be export default function activities since we're in the index.tsx of activities. And then the same goes for home. So we're going to have an export default function home. And lastly, export default function sign up. Then moving on, in our routes folder, we're going to make a user routes.tsx file. And we're going to do the same thing, export default function user routes. Next up, we're going to install a npm package called React Router DOM. This is to help us route our application together. And we're also going to save some React types using the command npm i save types React. And I also want to remind you at the top of the description, we have a link to this document that has the step-by-step of this video as we go along. And next, we're going to go through each file index, and we're going to return a p tag that just says hello from whatever the file name was. And in the user routes, we're going to make use of the create routes from elements inside of the create browser router component. This is basically just going to map our paths with our component of choosing. So here we have sign up path, which routes the component sign up. /home, which routes to home, /activities, which routes to the activities that we imported from above. And we also have this fallback path where if the path sign up, home, or activities is not hit, then we will route to this home path, home component, I should say. And as your application grows, you can keep adding these routes here. Next up, in our app.tsx file, we're going to need to add that outside in our root of the application. And we're going to return a route provider with the router equal to the user routes that we just made in our routes folder. And we're going to call it with some parentheses. Now we're also going to make a main.tsx file, which will mount our application to the DOM. Here we're simply going to call the create root function of React DOM from the React DOM client. And we're going to get the element by ID of root. And we're going to render our app file, which has all of our roots. And we're also going to have strict mode. This is optional, but strict mode will send 2 requests in every click and in every render, just so that this is thoroughly testing and thoroughly working as expected. And then you could run it by doing npm run build and an npm run dev in the terminal, and you should get the normal vite. And when you visit the page, you should get a hello from signup if you're in the signup page, or hello from home if you're in the home page. One last thing before we move on, we also made some changes in the index.html. We added the title habit tracker for developers there, and then we added a div with the ID root and a script that says that the source is main.tsx. Sweet, so now your views are set up, and we're going to move on to the components and the component setup. So for the component setup, we're going to add component functions to each view. Then we're going to add HTML and CSS to them, and then use state to display and modify and get data, and connect those with API calls, which I'll show you here in a little bit. Now, before I start, I want to show you the index.css file that we added, or app.css. So first we need to install Tailwind. So npm install /-d Tailwind CSS, npx Tailwind CSS init. And in the app.css of Tailwind, we want to just have this hashtag root with the text align center. This will just align our text to the center in the root. And then we're also going to have this index.css. In here, we're going to have basic CSS Tailwind. Here's our root. Here's our a tag, button hover, and lastly, media. I won't go in depth with these because this is HTML and CSS, and we could have a whole different video for this, and I don't want to make this too long. So we're just going to focus on the front end and back end for this project. And then we're going to import these style sheets inside of app.tsx. And now you've reached the front end checkpoint 1, which you can find the code up to this point on the first link of the description or in this document at the top here as well. The habit tracker for developers /tree/master. So now inside of our home folder, we're going to create a logo.tsx, this is the basic component structure. We're just going to export const logo is equal to this function. We're going to add the hero section, the hero, and we're also going to import a Strive logo. This can be any image, but we have to have a assets folder with a PNG inside of here, and then we just import that there. And now we already went over this, but then we install Tailwind and then add layout divs, which one for the background div and then one for the content. And here is the final component with styling. So we're going to import the Strive logo. We're going to have a section with these class names, the background logo with this class name, and a style with the background image using the URL, and passing in the Strive logo. The background size is cover, and background position, center. And here would be the content class names, an H1 tag that just says achieve more with Strive and crush your goals easily with these class names. And then lastly, we have a button here that we added with these class names and a call to action button that just says get started, which we will add some on-click functionality later in this video. And then below the code here, I also added the PNG in the document. And now we're going to update entry files that we just went through with importing index.css, import app.css, and we're going to set up the router if you have not done that. And now when you run the server, you should have something like this, achieve more with Strive. If you do not worry, you can find the code, as I just mentioned, in this front end checkpoint 1. Okay, now we're going to finish up the home components setup. All right, so first up, we're going to, inside of the home, we're going to add the logo component, or call it, import it at the top and call it. Then we're going to add 2 files, which being the features.tsx and socials.tsx, each with their own content, being exported. The features is going to have one section with an h2 tag and a div tag. And here in our features, this h2 tag has this class name, and this div is going to have this class name. And here we'll have a object. This object is going to have an icon, title, and description. Icon will display a simple image or emoji, and have a title, description. And we're going to map each of these feature and the index. So we're going to keep the key as the index. Pass in this as the class name for this div. And what this will do is we're going to make a div basically for each one of these objects. And each one will have an I tag for the feature.icon, icon tag, and h3 for the feature.title, and a p tag for the feature.description. Now for the socials, we're going to have one section tag, one h2 tag, and a div tag with another div inside of it that will hold this object, or this JSX, and an array of objects which will have a name and URL, which will be GitHub in this case, LinkedIn, and you can replace this URL with your GitHub URL and LinkedIn profile URL. And we're going to map these platforms, give it the key, the platform name, the URL of the platform. We're going to give this class name to the A tag, and we're also going to give this platform name be the text of the A tag. And then after that, we want to import them and use them inside of home. So we're going to import logo, features, and socials there. And now you should have something like this. With the features, feel free to connect with me, the GitHub and the LinkedIn there. Sweet, so now we're going to be starting the activities components. First up, we're going to add the activity logger.tsx inside of the activities folder. And we're also going to add activity totals.tsx and heatmap.tsx. For the activity logger, we're going to have an h2 tag that's log activity, and then we're going to have a big form tag. This is going to be the form that's going to be used for logging activities. We're going to have a couple labels and a couple inputs. The first input will be the activity name. The second input will be a date. The third input is going to be duration. Fourth is going to be hours. And fifth is going to be minutes. And we're going to leave some placeholders there for error handling. And then lastly, still inside of the form, at the very end, we're going to have a button that just says log activity. And this button is going to be on click should log the activity. Here are those class names with the div, outer div having this class name, h2 having this class name, the div having this class name, the first activity name having these class names, inputs with a placeholder as well, the date input here and their class names, and duration inputs here. Lastly, the submit button and its class names. Next up, we're going to set up the activity totals. Here we're going to have an h2 tag and then a table tag, which will have two headers, activity and totals. Here's them with their class names, CSS, h2 tag CSS, table CSS, and then the header CSS. Here's the heatmap.tsx initial setup. We're going to install using npm i react calendar heatmap to install and get the option to import this, as well as React tooltip. And we're going to have a outer div with an h2 tag that says activity heatmap, and a div for the content, which will be the calendar component and the tooltip component. And here is the completed version with class names, the CSS, div, h2, div, calendar heatmap. And here, if you notice, the start date, we're going to be the 1st of 2024, and the end date being the last day of 2024. And we're going to use activity for the activity data. We're going to use a empty array for the values until we set up state for that. And now we have some logic for the classes. If there is not a value, then we will want the color of the cell to be white, which is an empty cell. And now if the count is greater than 5, then we want to return a high activity cell, which will be a darker color. Now, lastly, normal activity, which is less than 5, will just have that color scale. This is how the log activity should look like, and this is how they will look like all together with the log activity, activity totals, and activity heatmap. Remember that you would have to import them inside of the activities page here with the activity logger, activity totals, heatmap, leaderboard. Or whoops, we're not doing leaderboard in this video. We're just doing the top 3. Next up, we're moving on to the signup components. In the index.tsx for signup folder, we're going to add an outer div and a header tag first with a p tag for the subtext. Next, we're going to add a button with a header tag on top of it for signing up, as well as the footer. So here we're at a footer and a button on top of that with a SVG. And next, we're going to add a path function that will contain the path to the GitHub icon we're using. So just for simplicity's sake, this should have a path at the top of the file. And then we have our regular function here, and we pass in that path as SVG. Now this is going to be the final version. Now again, you can go to this document and get this path name, so you can get the exact icon that I used, and these are its CSS. So we're gonna have this as the CSS for the outer. For the next div, we're gonna have this CSS welcome to Strive, success, your journey to achieve more, the next div, sign up, the button CSS, the SVG here, and then finally the footer class name. And now you should have something like this, welcome to Strive. If you don't worry, this is where checkpoint 2 comes in. You can find all the code up to this point at github.com, dj3577, habit tracker for developers, /tree/step1. Next up, we're going to start on the home page state setup. So to start off, we're going to make a new folder inside of source that's going to be hooks. We're going to have one hook per component. And we're also going to add a new folder called store. And this will be one file per entity. So here we're going to start off with the initial store for user.ts file. So here's a little bit cleaner version where we have a source store user.ts, the initial store, which is going to get the token from the windows.local storage. And we're also going to use an npm package called hook state for our global state of the application. We're going to use this inside of our user.ts. And now we're going to create a user object here that uses this state. We're also going to create an interface structure. So in source interfaces user.ts, we're going to define what the user will look like. This is more accurate with ID, username, and login. And then we're going to update the user store with this type, user type object as user type. And now we're going to update the first component, which being the update logo component, logo.tsx. So we're going to do is logged in, a new constant, and we're going to import user.state.user username.get. This will just mean if the user has a username, we know they're going to be logged in. So this value will be true. And we're also going to use a new constant that calls the useNavigate hook, which will navigate throughout the application. Now we use this in the button of logo here. So we'll use it on the onClick. On click, if they're logged in, then we want to navigate to /activities routes. If they're not logged in, then we want to navigate to sign up. And here we're going to display two different things. If they are logged in, then we want to say go to my activities. If they aren't logged in, then we want to just say get started for that button. And we also want to set up auth. So in the store, we're going to have a new file called auth.ts with these two functions, get token and get token type, and an initial store of this, which is getting the token and the token type. And now you can test this with npm run dev, then click on the button on the home page and it should redirect to sign up. As such, so here we're on the home page, I click get started and it sends me to sign up. Now we're going to create an auth store, so auth.ts, import hook state. We're going to have these helper functions that we made, the initial state structure, create state, passing in that initial store, and then we're going to export a auth object, export default author with the object having state and decode JWT, which will implement this function later. And now in our app.csx file, we're going to call this hook state using const auth state is equal to that hook state, passing in the import of auth.state. Now in a use effect, we're going to get the token from that auth state. If there's a token, then we want to call the auth.decode JWT, and we're going to have a dependency on the token. So this basically means once you log in, you're going to be given a token. So if we have a token on render, we're going to get your information and send a request to the backend to retrieve your information. Now implementing a decoder, this function will get the current token, decode it, and update the state with the user details. So here I'm in my auth store auth.ts, and here we have const destruct it from a call to the auth.decode JWT, and we're going to set it in the user state. I'll get into what this file is, which is the service folder and auth.ts in here in just a minute. So we're going to have an initial auth store set up with this state, and then again, like I just showed you, DQT. And now we need to create a authentication service. So we're going to import Axios. If you don't have this installed, do an npm I Axios, and then we're going to export a default no name object with a function inside of it called decode JWT, and we're going to return a axios.post to the URL or endpoint in our backend. Now, finally, in our hooks, we're going to have a use activity logger.ts, like I mentioned earlier, and we're going to export a default function that has the same name, use activity logger, with first the activity detail states. So we're going to have a state for the activity name, a state for the date, and a state for hours and minutes. And here we also have validation error states for hours and minutes, and we also get the user's current state here. And we're going to want to return all these values and their setters. So some key points: this hook is purely going to be used, but also could be used in a different components. So it could be using in different components, but this is the overall structure we're going to use for other components hooks. Now we're going to add a couple of functions. So we're going to add a function called handle hours change, which is going to take a React change element with the value being the target.value there, set it as a number, and then set the hours state to the number that was given on input, and the same structure for handle minutes change. Then to handle form submission, we're going to have another function, expression at this point. It's going to be asynchronous. It's going to take in a React form element event. If there's an error, then we want to return, and then we're going to calculate total duration in minutes by passing in the hours as a number. If there's not a number there, we just put 0 times 60 plus the number of minutes or 0. And then we're going to try catch here with a await to activity store dot create activity. So we're calling the create activity function inside of the activity store, passing in the input variables plus the user ID. And then we're going to return these, add them to the return statement in the object. And now since we called a activity store function, we got to set that up. So instead of store, we're going to have activities.ts, which will have a create activity that has an activity as the parameter. And we're going to return the activities.create service. We're going to export this store. In our service, we're going to export a interface here with ID, user ID, activity name, and date, and exporting a default no name object that's going to take an activity and call an Axios post to our backend at /activities. Now in our activity logger, we're going to call this hook and destruct all of its return values. And on the form, we're going to do the on submit and we'll submit here. In the activity input, we're going to set the activity name to be the value of that's getting passed in. Same goes for date. We're going to give it the value here of date, same as activity name with the value here. Handle hours, we're going to give the on change to be handle hour change, and then value being hours with a maximum of 15 and a minimum of 0, as we don't want a negative hour, negative time. And we also know that you aren't going to spend 24 hours on an activity, so we want to reduce that. And here's going to be our error handling. So if there's an hours error, then we want to show a p tag with that class name and the hours error. In our minute input, we're going to have the value be minutes, minimum, maximum 0.59, and the on change, we're going to pass in the handle minutes change. At the very end, in our button, we're going to have a disable that passes in the hours error with checks for truthy, which basically means that if there's an hours error, then it's going to return true. Or if there's a minutes error, it's going to return true as well. Now we're going to set up the activities total state. So in our hooks folder in useActivity.ts, we're going to have an export function, use activity totals, and there's going to be a couple states here. We're going to have the state of activity totals, or I guess we'll just have one state, which is the activity total state, and we're passing in an empty object for that use state, and we're going to have a function inside use activity totals that's going to fetch activity totals. So we're going to take the response, we're going to have a const response, and we're going to call activity store and the get activity totals function from that store. And then we're going to use the activity totals and set it to the response of that. And now we're going to have a function called convert to minutes, which is going to take in total minutes and convert it to hours and minutes format. The hours being total minutes divided by 60, and then minutes being total minutes and modulo of 60, so that we can return hours, blank hours is blank minutes in a string. Then we're going to have a setup, which is going to be used in a use effect, which will happen on every render. This is just to initialize data fetch. So as soon as we render the page, we fetch your activity totals. That works. And we're going to have a dependency on the user state user so that it'll change every time that you log in with a different user. Now we're going to have to add a activities file inside of store, which will have a couple of functions here. We're going to have the create activity and get activity totals, which will call the activity services. So the activity service create activity for this function, and then get activity totals in the activity service for the get activity totals in the store. And then we're going to export a default object, which is activity store, passing in the two functions that we just made. And now we need to make a activity service, or this one was actually already made. Yeah. So we would just add the get activities totals and get activity totals here in the service. And now we're going to build out the activity totals with the hook we just made. So we're going to destruct activity totals and then convert to minutes from our use activity totals hook. And in the T body, we're going to map every activity totals for every activity which has an interface that looks like this, which is the activity name, passing in the activity for the interface and the activity name specifically of this interface, which basically this is per activity. For every activity inside of activity totals, we're going to give it a TR tag with the key being the activity name, this class name, and a TD tag nested with the activity name and the activity total duration. Now lastly, we're going to set up the heat map and sign up state. Sign up state is really simple. This is the heat map first though. We're going to make a new hook called useHeatMap.ts, and we're going to define a activity date structure with a date and a count, which will be the dates our will log their activities and the amount of activities that they logged during that day. Then we're going to have a function useHeatMap with a state of with the state of activity dates. And if you notice, we pass in activity dates interface as the use state interface, and then we also pass in an empty array here. We're going to have a function that fetches activity dates that's asynchronous with a try catch, and we're going to take the const response is equal to the activity store dot get activity dates and set the activity date state of the response data dot activity dates. And now we're going to initialize this on every render by having a setup function that's a callback and calling this setup inside of our use effect, so that when we mount and render the page, we're going to fetch all of the user data. And then lastly, we're going to return activity dates because that's the not only, but we're going to return it to use it in our only used value in the heatmap.tsx. And then inside of our store in our activity.ts file, we're going to add this get activity date, return it here. And then in our service for activities, so in our activity.ts in our service, we're going to add this get activity dates, which throws or calls a axios.get call to activities/dates. Then now in our heat map, we can implement this functionality. So we're going to call the heat map use heat map hook. We're going to get the activity dates from that hook, use that value here in the calendar heat map. And then in our tooltip data attributes, for every value, we're going to have a title, which is going to be equal to, if there's no value, then we're going to have no activities. If there is a value, then we want to do the count. If it's greater than 1, then we want to say that count plus activity. If it's equal to 1, then we want to say it's singular. If it's greater than 1, it's plural, which is activities. And then these are just class names that are going to be returned for the data attributes here. And lastly, we're going to set up the sign up hook, which is going to be the use signup.ts inside of our hooks folder. And this is going to be using the environment files. If you ever used this before, we're going to export default function of use signup. And we're going to have one singular function here that's handle GitHub login, which will use the location.href inside of the windows to navigate to this URL, which will use the OAuth authentication for GitHub and will require you to sign up through GitHub. And then we return an object with this function. And for the environment setup, you're going to have a .env.development file in your front end, which will have the byte GitHub client ID. You can find this pretty easily just by Googling this, how to get your GitHub client ID. And then for the redirect URI, we're going to have it attached to the http:/localhost5173/activities. For some fun, you could try to run the server right now, but there is some issues because we don't have our API set up and running yet. But that concludes almost concludes. We need to first set up the Axios. So in our services, we're going to have to add a new file called axios.ts. We're going to have an instance that uses the base URL by API URL, which for this will just be your localhost 3000 API or whatever your port is on for your backend. And then we're going to add a handle logout in this file that's going to remove any token that we would have and token type and redirect to the login. Or this would be redirecting to home actually. And then we're going to have an interceptor. All this is going to take your configuration headers and set them correctly up to make sure if you have a local storage token, then we want to set it to the headers of the authorization. And lastly, we're going to have another interceptor, which if our token has expired, then we want to handle logout. And finally, export default instance. And now in our store for activities, or not store, for services, we want to use this Axios instance. So we won't import straight from Axios. We're going to import from our Axios that we just made for activities and for auth, which we'll get into auth and login with GitHub in just a minute. Or actually, I'll get into it right now. So with login GitHub, we're going to have this function here inside of our auth.ts services, which is going to do an axios.post to /auth/GitHub. and we're going to pass in the code. This is going to be used in a store, the auth.ts inside of store, which is going to take the response of the token and user and set it as the GitHub token. And then we're going to return that here in the auth object. And now inside of handle GitHub login, this is actually what it's going to look like. So this is going to be inside of the auth. This is a new folder inside of views, which is auth. And this is going to be handle GitHub login.tsx with using the search from use location, the URL parameters, which takes the search of this and sets it up nicely. Then we're going to get the code from the URL parameters and use this code, passing it into auth.login with GitHub. And then in the use effect, if there's a code, then we want to fetch GitHub token. So basically, when you get redirected to the GitHub login and you log in successfully, you're going to be redirected back to the activities page. From here, this is going to get loaded, our activities and their proper components. We call this handle GitHub login so that we can take the code, it'll return a code inside of the URL. We'll take that code and send it to the backend to log in using their GitHub ID and get their information through that way. So this code won't run if there isn't a code in the URL. So this will only run the first time that you log in with GitHub, and then after that point, you're logged in and won't have a code in the URL, so it won't run anymore. You have now completed all state and components. I'm going to be moving on to the backend. If you are lost or something happened, got code, your dog ate your code, you can find the code up to this point on the first link of the description in that document here, or going just to this link, GitHub DJ3577 habit tracker for developers /trace-tap step 2. Nice. Now we're going to move on to the backend setup. This will be a entirely new folder outside of the front end folder. We're going to need to install the necessary packages for TypeScript and Node.js, add the file structure, and then we're going to run our server. So here I'm in my backend and I just ran npm init. So here I ran npm init. I add a package name. It tells you the version. It's fine with whatever it is. The description. I added a small description here, but that's completely optional. Entry point, index test is fine. Test command, you can leave that blank. It'll fill it in. Git repository. You could push the code to GitHub. Doesn't really matter. Keywords, license, and then it writes that package.json. Now we're going to add a new folder called server. Inside of server, we're going to have a app.ts, and we're going to call the express from the npm package express. So we're going to have the npm I express. From there, I had a little trouble, but you're also going to need to add the types for express. From there, we're going to do an await loaders. I'll explain what that is in a bit, and do an app.listen to port 5000. And the function that it takes in for the second parameter is going to be an error. So it's going to throw an error there. And then we can say if there's an error that happens, then we should console log the error and exit the application. The loaders will be everything that's needed to load before the app has fully initialized with Express. And here this is what I noticed, that I actually need types. So I had to do npm I --save -dev at types node. Now I'm going to add a new folder called loaders. Inside of loaders, we're going to have an index.ts file. In this index.ts file, we're going to have a express loader that we call inside of it. And we're going to pass in the express app. So here I'm getting the express app from the parameter in and passing it into the express loader. From there, we're going to make a new file called express.ts inside of our loaders folder. And here's also when I realized I need to do an npm I save dev for the types in express. And here it's going to be another node name object that we're going to export default. And this is the layer that we can call and make our APIs on. Do an app.get, whatever the route is. And then the second parameter is the function that is going to use the request and response. And then here was actually supposed to be an optional error and the type unknown, because it can't be anything, but it also we don't fully know what the error will be. So that's why we have it typed as unknown. Next up, we're going to add some scripts. So I add a npm start here. So I had this start script and a build script. This is just for ease of life things. So the start, when you run npm run start, it's going to do node in this dist/server app, and it's going to run our application. And the build is going to compile all of our code. And now we're also going to add a TypeScript config.json on the root of our folder with all these specifications that will be the TypeScript settings, basically. There's kind of a lot of them, but they're just ease of life things.
And here at the very end is the most crucial one, is to include that our code is going to be at server /*/*. That's just going to do basically everything under server is going to be included in the compilation. And we're going to exclude node modules, tests, and dist because we don't want that to be recompiled. And here this port is actually supposed to be 3000. I go crazy here and I put an 8000. And one thing to note that I found out recently is that if the port number is actually too high, it will block your requests, interestingly enough. And then I also ended up going with a constant at the top. That's going to be the port, just so that we can use it in the name and the same port. So in the case that we have to change it in the future, we only have to change it in one place, and that's just another ease of life. And yeah, boom, got your server. You can now do an npm run build and npm run start, and it should say starting server on port 6000 if you have this console log. And now you reach your backend checkpoint 1. You can find all the code up to this point on the first link in the description in the document here, or just visit this link, github.com/djg3577, have a checker for devs. Now we're going to do an endpoint setup. We're going to do an endpoint setup. We're going to make the first backend endpoints, make backend middleware for authentication requests. Need to revise this. So this is going to be one of those ones where I pull up the code because my first implementation didn't go very well. Let's just say it that. My dog ate the code. We'll just leave it at that. So here we're going to remove the test route that we just made, the / whatever, and we're actually going to start adding some settings for the Express. So first one that we're going to add is going to enable cross-origin resource sharing. All that means is it's going to allow us to send requests with different things. At a high overview, this is just a bunch of settings that we want on our Express. They're also ease of life things, so we don't have to actually always check for certain things. The most important one that you need to have, though, is this app.use routes. This is going to load all of our routes. And to start off, we're going to make a new folder called API. And then inside that folder, we're going to have a routes folder with a index.tsx. In that file, we're going to do an export default no name function. And we're going to initialize a constant that's an app, which is equal to router from Express. And we're going to call all of our API functions here and then return the app. And I'll get into why we do this right now. So we're going to make a new auth folder inside of routes. We're also going to make another couple folders like activities and things like that a little bit later on. But each folder is going to have their own dedicated files. So auth is going to have auth.ts. And here we're going to export default another no name function that takes in an app. And before that, we initialize a constant that's equal to router. And now we're going to say we're going to use app.use/auth and pass in this route. This is going to make it so that any API call that we have, any endpoint call that we have on this page is going to need to start on /auth. Now, if you're making a small project, this isn't going to be a big deal, but when this project grows, say that we want massive amounts of different endpoints because our customers are demanding and they want the best of the best, right? So this file, all of them are going to start with /auth whatever to make the post. So we might as well just have these grouped routes where every single route after this point has to start with /auth. So here when I add this route, that's route.post, it's going to need to first start with /auth in order to be hit. So to hit this decode JWT, we have to do /auth, then /decode JWT. This is a bunch of easy to life things that is a little bit abstract, but very, very useful. And the second parameter that this post takes in, because it's the same thing as a route, the second parameter is going to be a function. We'll get into that in a little bit. But here, when we go back to the index.tx, this actually should be index.ts. So that's my bad. But it should be index.ts, and we're going to import this, auth routes. Yeah, so we're going to do auth routes from auth/auth. And now we're going to add another new file that is activity.ts inside of a activity folder that's inside of our routes. That's another no name export default function. Here we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do app.use/activities. And here I'm not supposed to do app.post. It's supposed to be route.post. But here is going to have 3 endpoints. We're going to have one post, one get at the base activity / there. And then the third get will be /dates. So in order to hit this endpoint, we would do /activities/dates. But to hit these first two, it'll just be /activities/ and then whatever the call is, so post or get. And then we do the same thing in the user.ts inside of a user folder, or is going to hold all of our user routes. And here I'm just going to call npm I method override because that was one of the settings that I added in the Express loader itself. Added 2 packages, and then you can just do an npm run start and your server will run. Sweet. So now that our endpoints are set up and are just needing to add those controllers and services that we need to use, we're going to set up the database. So we're going to make the tables required for the application using Postgres and pgadmin. So you could find those by either Googling Postgres, pgadmin. I also have the links in the documentation below. And once you have Postgres installed, you can add a server by clicking that plus sign and then name it whatever you would like. From there, you just click the create server. You first have to make a new folder, by the way, specifically for it. Unless it's your first time using Postgres, then you don't need to. You can just use the folder that it tells you. But in my case, I have to make a new folder specifically for the database. And then we're going to click initialize. From there, it is running. And now we can connect to it using pgadmin. And the way we connect to it is right click on the existing server that you have. And then it should say create server. Then just give it a name, server group. From there, it'll make it. And then we right click and create a new server. We'll name this habit tracker DB. Should have been habit tracker for devs/server. And for the host name, it's going to be localhost. This is how you connect to your localhost. And once inside, you click on the little drop down and you can click on adding a new database. Right click on it and then add the habit tracker for this database and then save that. And then inside the new database that you just made, click on schemas, public, and tables, and create a table. From there, you can create the users table and you click save. And then we also want to create the activity table. The users table is going to store all our users for the application, and the activity is going to store all of the activities that users make. And the first query that we're going to hit or run is going to be an alter table user. And this is going to add all the columns that are necessary. This actually is not fully updated. The tracker for devs has a better updated version of it. So here for activity, the query should be like this. We're going to alter the table activity. We're going to add these columns. So an activity ID, that's going to be the serial primary key. Add a user ID column, which is going to be an integer. This is going to store the user ID for the person that did the activity. And then we're going to have activity name, which is going to be a varchar, basically just a string. And we're going to have the duration of that activity would be a integer, same syntax as integer, or it's the equivalent as saying integer. And then we're going to add column date. So we're going to have a date the activity has been done. And we're going to add a foreign key constraint to user to make sure that we always want to reference the user primary key as this user ID here. Then you run it by pressing the play button at the top. And now we have to add these necessary columns for the user table, which is just 3. We're going to alter table user, add these 3 columns, which is going to be the user ID, which is the primary key, GitHub ID, which is going to be the GitHub ID, and the GitHub login, which will be the username of that person's GitHub. And then you can execute this using the play button. Now your database is set up. Now we can add the Postgres loader inside of our loaders. But first, we got to make this Postgres file. So here we're going to add a Postgres.t inside of loaders. And what this is going to contain is a export default no name function that's asynchronous. We're going to do const pull is equal to a new pull. We're going to have to do an npm I pg if you don't have these, and npm I type die. And from there, you want to have environment variables for the user, host, and database. And we're going to register the pull in the container, which will just allow us to use the pull across the whole backend code. You don't got to worry about this much. And then we're going to return the pull and catch an error if there was an error. And then if you don't already have one, you should have an .env file with the following in the root directory of your backend repository. First is the GitHub redirect URI. This is going to be needed a little bit later. This is just going to tell GitHub where to send the user after they authenticate them. So in this case, it's going to be our local host 5173/activities. The GitHub client ID, it's going to be your client ID. The secret is going to be your client secret. You can just Google how to get your GitHub client secret. The database name is going to be whatever you chose for the database name. Our host is going to be localhost. Port, in this case, ours was 5432. Wow, I can't talk. JWT is going to be your JWT key, and the database user is going to be Postgres. Next up, we have controllers. Controllers act as the intermediary intermediary. Let me just stop trying to be smart. Typo. Controllers act as the middle between HTTP requests and our business logic services. So first we're going to add a new folder called controllers that is going to have the index.ts file inside of it. And here is just going to be a object that's named controllers. We're going to export default this object, and we're going to import auth and activity. You won't have these just yet. So inside of our controllers, we're going to have a activity folder with a activity.ts. Here's going to be all the controllers that take in the request and the response. So for log activity, we're going to have one that's asynchronous function. Log activity is going to take in the request and response. We're going to get the activity service. We haven't made just yet, but we're going to call this service specifically a function inside of it that's create user from GitHub, and we're gonna pass in the request.user, and then we're also going to initialize a constant result, which is equal to the activity service.log activity, and we're going to pass in the request.body and request.user. Then we're going to return with the status 200 and the JSON response of result. And we can use request.user because where we call this is how the updated version of the activity.ts in our routes is going to look like. We're going to call controllers, which we just made, and the activity, which was imported into controllers, like so, with the activity here. And then we're going to have access to all the functions here, which we'll get into all of them in just a minute. But we also want to call this GitHub auth middleware. So what is this? This is going to be the middleware that's going to be ran, as the name mentions, in the middle between the request and the response. This is going to be a new file in GitHub auth.ts inside of a middleware folder that is inside of APIs. And here we're just going to add a couple things. So first we're going to start off with the interfaces that we're going to have. The GitHub user interface is going to have an ID for the GitHub user and a login. And we're also going to modify the global interface a little bit to include that the request is going to have a user ID and a GitHub user. You know what? Scratch that. I don't think we need that. Sorry. We're going to have a GitHub auth middleware. And this is going to be a function that's going to pass in a request, a response, and next. We do this for most middlewares. Here, we're going to initialize the auth header, request.header authorization. If we do not have an auth header, we're going to return a 401 error that's no authorization header provided. From there, we're going to split the auth header into the bearer and the token. If we do not have the bearer or a token, or the lowercase version of bearer is not equal to bearer, then we're going to say that token is in an invalid format. And from there, we're going to take the GitHub URL API and pass in the authorization headers and send the axios.get request. You might need to do an npm I to Axios and its types to get this typed correctly. And then we're going to set the response of data as the request.user. And then call next. So now when our function reaches the controller function that we just made, it's going to properly run and be great. So here in the log activity, when we say request.user, this is going to work correctly, using that GitHub user that we pass in. The next function that we're going to have in activity.ts inside of the activity folder in our controllers is going to be the get activity totals. From here, we're going to have a try catch any errors. We're going to call the activity service and do a container.get activity service. We're also going to initialize activity totals as the return value of the activity service.get activity totals, passing in the request.user.id. We're going to return a 200 with activity totals being the JSON. And the third function we're going to have is get activity dates. That again gets the activity service. We're going to get the dates by calling a get activity dates function of activity service, passing in request user ID, and respond with a 200 with the activity dates. From there, we can actually move on to making the service. So if I go into the service, this is inside of a new folder called services under activity folder, activity.ts. In here, we have two interfaces, the activity and the GitHub user. This is how I realized earlier that we had a duplicate one, and that's why I deleted the earlier version. So our activity is going to take in or have the ID, user ID, activity name, duration, and date. GitHub user is going to have a login and an ID. So to declare a service, we have to do @service from type die. And we're also going to use the pull from PG in this page. And we say the class is going to be activity service. It's basically just exporting a default no name function, but use this class to be able to do a container get and then use those functions inside of wherever we're calling it. The first function we have is log activity. It's going to take in an activity with the type of activity and the user with the type of GitHub user. Here is where our container.get pull comes in. This is going to be our database. We connect to our database, and then we run the query insert into activity and pass in all of the activity and user details with the corresponding values. So here, user ID, activity name, activity duration, and the date, and then we release the client. And if you remember, this is called in the log activity controller. Next up is we have the function get activity totals, which takes in the GitHub ID when we first initialize the database doing container.get pull. Then we're going to have the client connect to it and query the client with a select statement that gets the activity name, the sum of all the duration as total duration, and the count of all the responses as total sessions from activity, where the GitHub ID is equal to the first parameter that we pass in, grouped by the activity name. And then we're going to release it and return the rows that are provided by this. And again, if you remember, we use this inside the get activity totals of the controller. Now going back to the service, we're going to make another function called create user from GitHub ID, passing in the GitHub user, connect to the database. Then we're going to say we're going to begin our queries. Then we're going to check for existing user by selecting the user ID from the user table where the GitHub ID is equal to 1, or equal to the first parameter. If there's an existing user, then we should just commit. This just means if there's an existing user, we don't need anything else and we can just commit. But if there's not an existing user, then we'll hit this case where we're going to insert into the user table and pass in the GitHub ID with the GitHub login as values as a first and second parameter passed in here, and then we commit. And if you remember, we use this inside of the log activity. Also, what was this one for? So the log activity was actually for, oh yeah, they're both used. So this is just to make sure we call this log activity create user from GitHub ID before we call the log activity, to make sure that when we log an activity, we have a user to have a relationship with. Otherwise, we're going to have an undefined ID, or the user hasn't been made yet in our database, and it's going to log an activity under a no name or no ID person. Next up, we have the auth service. This is going to be used in all of our auth endpoints. So here in our auth controller, so there's going to be an auth.ts in our controllers. We're going to have the first function be decode JWT, which is going to, as the name implies, decode the JSON web token that is provided in the request. First, we're going to initialize the auth service. If we do not have an auth header, we're going to throw an error, or not throw, but respond with an error. And then finally, we're going to call the authenticate user function, which is going to parse the header using this parse header function that's going to take in the token type and the token. If we don't have a token, then we're going to say this is an invalid authorization header format. If not, then we're going to return the token and the token type. And then depending on this token type, because this could be either a JWT or a GitHub type, we're going to do two different things. If it's just normal JWT, we authenticate this user by calling a decode JWT function, where we validate the JWT using the process.environmentFile.jwt key. I'm going to remove that console log. We verify the token and get the decoded JWT payload here. Let me remove that. And then if it didn't decode correctly, or if we don't have a user ID, then we have an invalid token payload. Otherwise, we're going to catch one of these errors. From there, we're going to get the user ID, connect to the database, and select the information that we need, and then return that in the response. If we don't have a user at all in general from this, then we're going to throw an error. Otherwise, we're just going to return the user. Now, in the case that the token type is a GitHub type, then we're going to make a function called GitHub user with the parameter being access token. And we're going to call this access token in the GitHub API authentication, passing in the headers as the bearer with the access token, and do an axios.get using the headers and the token URL. And then we're going to return that data. And lastly, we're going to return that user in a JSON. And if I didn't mention it, this is going to be another new service called auth.ts in an auth folder inside of the services, again with the same syntax as earlier. And the second function that we're going to have in the controllers is an asynchronous GitHub login. It's going to take in the request response. This is going to be passed in a code, which is going to be the GitHub access code. We're going to load the auth service. We're going to get the response from the auth service.exchange GitHub token function, passing in the code. And here, if we don't have a code, then we want to throw an error. Otherwise, we want to take our environment file variables and use those, initialize them, and use them inside the request body alongside the URL that we want to hit and the request head parameters. All in all, to get the token response, we're going to do we're going to wait for this axios.post, passing in the token URL for the URL that we're going to hit. The request body is going to be the client ID, client secret, redirect URI, and the code. And lastly, the modifications we're going to make is the request headers and passing in those as the headers. If we don't get an OK from this, then we're going to throw another error. But if that doesn't happen, then we know that we got the user, so the access token. So we can pass this access token to the GitHub user, which will just run this GitHub URL API and use that access token to get the user from GitHub. And that's why we initialize user here. And then we're going to return the access token as well as the user. And we're at the end of the day in our controller, we're going to return the response in a JSON. And now we can do controllers.auth, get GitHub login here for the /GitHub, and for the /decodegdbt, we can do controllers.auth decodegdbt. For the activities, we're going to call the GitHub middleware for the post, the get, and the other get for the dates. And we're also going to pass in the corresponding controllers for this third parameter. And I don't believe that I showed the final loader. So here's what the final loader will look like. The index.tsx for the loader. We're going to wait for this database loader to load. Then we're going to have a console log database loader. And this database loader is just going to be the Postgres.ts file that we made earlier. And here we were calling the express app as a parameter and passed in as the app. And this is what our final app looks like. I had to import env here and call the .env.config. That was a little confusing in there in order to achieve the environment files that we needed. We're running on port 3000. We call the loaders with the express app passed in as the app. And then we call the start server here. And yeah, that is the full project. You can find the final code for the backend here or in the top link of the description. You can also find the final code for the front end code here. And this is what the final project should look like. We have a header at the top. Oh, I think I forgot that. Let me get into that in just a minute. We have the header at the top here. We're gonna have your activities, activity with the activity name. So I'm gonna do puck. You can do the calendar component here, hours, log that, and then heat map here. If I refresh, I have poke here, and then the heat map gets a little updated with the 6 activities, 1. And let's do the header real quick. Forgot about that. So here in our user routes, in the first route component, we're going to call this header. And what the header is going to be inside of our routes folder, header.tsx. It's going to be a function where we call the hook of use navigate and another hook state, which is going to grab the auth state. We're going to check if it's logged in. Like earlier in the application, we're going to do auth state token.link. So it makes sure that if we have a token and the token length exists, then we know that we're logged in. And depending if we're logged in, we're going to show a log out label. If not, we're going to show a sign up with the command of the corresponding log out and navigating to home. Or in the sign up, we're just going to navigate to the /sign route. Then we're going to set these nav items as the auth item, as this whole auth item, just to make it more readable. And here we're going to have a header with this class name, div, another div, and another div. That's a strive. And then on click, we're going to navigate to the /activities. And then we're going to have a nav, a UL with this class name. And then we're going to map the nav items with a li, the key being the item.label, the command being the on click here, item.command, and class name. And then for the li, we're going to have the item.label. And that's pretty much it. That is the whole project. Again, you can find the final code here at the end of the document, at the top of the link, at the top of the description, backend code here, and the front end code here, final front end code here.